This is the City Sites Podcast with Larry Kutzler.
Leaders hate structure, but followers love it. Take a look at your own life. There's areas in your life where you're a leader, and there's other areas of your life where you're a follower. So don't break it down naively to say you're either a leader or a follower. We're all both in different areas of our lives. Okay? In work, are you holding events? Are you an event organizer? If you are, provide structure in the form of a very detailed agenda. But the people who are coming to the event, they like this because it buys the risk out, right? They know exactly what they're going to get because this is a detailed agenda, so they can visualize it. The more detailed the agenda, the more information you can provide, the better. They did a study once, and event descriptions that were more detailed and longer had twice the attendance of event descriptions that were shorter. People like knowing, give them as much information as you can.
When an organization is at its best, a culture is going to energize its employees, and it's going to make people feel good about what they do to advance the strategic and operating priorities of the company. It's really an emotional energizer that you can't get anywhere else.
It's unbelievable the degree to which our sanity depends on a functioning sociological structure. And here's why. Well, first of all, you kind of need to know what to do every day. You have to have a routine. You need to know approximately when you should get up. It should be approximately the same every day. You need to know approximately when you're going to eat. You need to know what you're going to eat. You need to know who you're going to eat with. You need to know where to buy your food. It's like 80% of your life consists of those things that you do every single day, that you repeat. So you need structure, you need predictability, and you need more of it than you think, just to keep you sane.
You know the old saying about what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, today I have a topic that resembles that old saying. Leadership and structure. What comes first? I would say leadership is what most likely we focus on today because everyone has an opinion on what leadership means and what it should produce. We spend less time on structure. However, in my understanding, it is the structure that dictates how leaders lead the organization. Structure allows the giftings of the leader to use those gifts without the danger of those gifts becoming a stumbling block to either the leader or the organization. Someone has said you never want to see talent supersede character, so structure is what helps the character of the organization thrive. Now, there are organizations with great leaders but little structure. At the same time, we have great organizations with lots of structure but few great leaders to lead. So, no matter what, there are no perfect formulas to employ to figure out how to lead people. However, today I want to explore two dimensions that are critical to any organization, whether you are leading a large company or pastoring a small church. Everything is about leadership and structure. So I decided to have this conversation with a good friend of mine who challenged me on this theme a few weeks ago. My friend David is from Las Vegas, Nevada. He is a telecommunications executive who works in the Southwest, and he sits on many nonprofit boards, including the elder board at his church. One of his gifts is centered around bringing the best practices of leadership and best practices of structure together to make successful organizations. So, David, before we get into leadership and structure, I know there are some great positives about Las Vegas. Everyone says, well, whatever happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, but there's positives. Tell us some of the positives about Las Vegas.
Hey, Larry, thanks for having me. And yeah, there's a lot of good things that come out of Las Vegas. Good food, good entertainment, good sports, and great opportunities. Maybe a little bit about Las Vegas. You know, we have about 40 million visitors every year. They're coming in for conventions and for weddings. In fact, we have about 22,000 conventions we host every year in Las Vegas, which helps us fill our 150,000 hotel rooms that are there as well.
Wow.
But I got to remind you, we are in the desert, so we get less than 4 inches of rain a year, which also makes us pretty good at water conservation and environmentalism as well. But I mentioned great opportunities for churches and ministries to thrive in Las Vegas.
And there are great churches. I mean, I've learned that from you. You go to a great church called The Crossing, but there there are great churches, big churches, and churches that are thriving in the middle of a, can we say, Sin City?
That would be an accurate statement. And I think that's why people who go to church in Las Vegas are very purposeful and go to church for a very specific reason. And we notice that moving from the Midwest to the Southwest, specifically Las Vegas, people who go to church do it very purposefully.
Very good. Well, the reason I wanted this conversation with you, because number one, you're an executive of a large company, and you've had to deal with some of the structure that company, goes through, and you've been involved in policy making and so forth and so on. Plus, you are a nonprofit guy. You're an elder in your church. You've sit on a couple of national boards, and I was impressed with the things you were telling me of how you were able to come into some of these nonprofits that were struggling, and you put some structure to it, and somehow through that structure they began to thrive. So usually we think that the leader of an organization is the key person, but I'm not so sure after talking with you. You sort of turned my head around and said, no, first it's structure. Tell us why.
Yeah, leadership is very important, Larry, and you're right on. However, for leadership to be effective, it must have appropriate structure in which to operate. And you think about structure provides a framework for an organization to operate, including how the leader will serve the organization. And when you think of structure, it could include simple things like vision, mission, values, norms of how the organization will operate. And all of those provide the leader with an environment in which they can operate successfully.
Right.
So maybe even take it from a global perspective and think of the United States, the country that we live in. In over 200 years, a structure was put in place by which our country would operate. The division of powers between state and the federal government, the different branches of the federal government, how they operate together. And within that framework that's put together is why the leadership, which changes over time within the organization, has been able to be effective at leading our country.
I would agree. If we can shift from, say, the larger organization, because they're more geared that way anyway, right? They have HR programs and HR committees and departments and so forth that help to put structure in place for the employees. But the nonprofit world is not so elaborate. In fact, my experience in most churches and nonprofits I've worked for, there's been no structure. It's all dependent on the leader. The leader is the key. And that leader sometimes takes some liberties, and the organization can get into trouble pretty quickly. So when we talk about nonprofits, how does a leader and structure in a nonprofit work together? Unpack that for us.
Yeah, and you got to understand what season is the organization in. If this is a startup ministry, a startup organization, one of the leader's first responsibility is to establish that structure by which the organization will operate. Not only establish it, but get buy-in from the vested parties within the organization as well. And as they're establishing that structure, that now is foundational work from which the organization can grow and develop and strengthen itself. But understand that skill set for putting the structure in place often comes with startup leaders. Is not necessarily a role or responsibility of the sustaining leaders that might take that organization to the next level as well. So depending on the season of the organization, that leader has a different responsibility, the first of which establish the structure needed to operate.
That's kind of like the visionary, isn't it? I mean, they kind of have a vision of what they want to do, and then once that vision is established, then it seems like the managers come in and kind of hold it together. So you had the opportunity, David, to go into a couple of nonprofits, or say one nonprofit, and you were able to take what was established and sort of, I don't know if you did away with the structure of it and reinsert new structure, but you did something that the structure itself helped to make that nonprofit function. What did you do?
Yes, there's a couple instances where I've been brought into a local nonprofit board with the idea of trying to either jumpstart it or assess to say, should this organization continue in this local area? And I think the first step of doing any of that is just that whole assessment process. What do we have in place? Do we have the right leaders in place? Do we have the structure in place? Do we have a commonly understood vision, mission, and values, and norms on how we're going to operate? And Typically what I've seen is through a transition of leadership, perhaps the organization or the existing structure has either lost interest, lost direct involvement, or has lost their being anchored to the why they're doing what they are doing. And so in these couple instances, being able to do some assessment of the local leadership and the board of directors, it really was a matter of just anchoring the organization back to why we exist. Why does the organization exist? What are we trying to accomplish towards that vision? And what are those norms in which we're going to operate and agree to operate to accomplish that vision that the organization has? And I got to tell you, I think of Bill Collins, Larry, in his book, Good to Great. He talks about to increase the probability of success in an organization needs to have a clearly defined set of values. And he goes on to say that it doesn't matter what those values are, they just need to be articulated and well understood. And I found that to be true in these organizations as well. Re-articulate the values and the why of what we're doing, put the right leaders in place, put the right guidelines or framework in place for which they will operate and make decisions. And then it appeared that the organization was being able to get back on track and start growing in accomplishing their vision as well.
Well, if we're talking about structure, you almost have to have that vision and mission and all of that in place before you look for a leader, don't you? Because don't you want to match the leader with the vision? You don't want somebody who doesn't fit well. You know, if he doesn't have the same vision or mission propensity, I think you're just going to ask for problems, aren't you?
Yeah, I think you will. And obviously, you know, Bill Hybels would use the phrase that vision leaks. In other words, over time, the vision of an organization, it starts degrading because people are not reminded of it. So again, how important is it to anchor every person in that organization back to the why of what we're doing, the vision of what we are doing? I think that's so important. When you talk about the leaders needed to bring in and support the vision and the mission, you've got to understand that there are different seasons of an organization as well. And whereas that visionary, that initial founder of the organization might have that fresh vision and rally the organization around, typically the skill sets needed to sustain the organization are different. And that sustaining of the organization, the leader needs to know, how am I going to operate within this? You see, Larry, the vision stays the same regardless of the season of the organization.
Interesting.
The mission might change. The how you do this or what specifically we're going to do to accomplish the vision might change over time depending on the season, how society has changed, culture has changed, all of that. But that vision stays the same across all the seasons of the organization.
You know, it seems to me that sometimes, and I've not had the experience as you have in a large corporation, but in smaller churches and nonprofits, it seems like we always look for a leader who is gregarious, it can teach, and you know, just as good with people and whatever. And that's kind of a gifting or a talent, but you know as well as I do that talents, as good as they may be, cannot supersede the character of the organization or the individual. And I think what you're saying, at least what I'm taking from what you're saying, is structure is that character. It's the character principles and values that the organization has that the leader can't supersede, because if he does or she does, we're in trouble.
Yeah, the issue there, Larry, is if it is a leader-driven organization rather than a values or a vision-driven organization, the organization will rise and fall on the basis of the strengths of that leader or the failures of that leader. So by putting a structure in place, that leader now can operate within the structure to accomplish the vision, and it does anchor that leader to the vision. Sometimes we think of the reporting relationships within an organization as the most critical. That's just one small aspect of offering accountability within the organization. How does the organization make decisions? What is the governance structure needed to ensure that the organization stays on pace towards accomplishing the vision? How do we evaluate the leader of the organization through that governance council? Those are all key aspects that need to be in place for a thriving and growing organization.
But you have been around the church a long time. You're an elder in a very large megachurch in the Las Vegas area. It seems to me, though, that a lot of the decisions we we make about leadership has nothing to do with what we're talking about. I mean, it seems like big churches or big ministries really are based on the talents of the individual. That's what we look for as Americans. Can you succeed at growing this church, doing this and doing that? And sometimes structure just is kind of thrown out the door. Respond to that.
Great observation, Larry. And again, if we are a pastor or a leader-driven organization, I think our chance of success is not nearly as strong as if we encompass a plurality of leadership in the structure of the organization. And that plurality might be in the shape of a board of directors, council of elders, a leadership council, but some sort of organization that's responsible for the vision that supports and holds the leader, the chief leader, or the lead pastor accountable towards accomplishing that vision.
Well, I have seen in my experience the large church in the metro area had a failure, a pastoral failure, moral failure, and that church lost a lot of people immediately, but they stopped the bleeding because the strength of that church was in their organization, and they were able to quickly get another temporary leader that was brought in to sort of, close up the wound and bandage it, and then pick a new leader that moved the organization forward. A lot of times that doesn't happen. So let me ask this. You walk into the doors of one of these organizations you mentioned about, and you see that it's not working. What's the first thing you do? Walk us through it.
Yeah, probably the first thing I do is come in and do an assessment. And that initial assessment is, what season is the organization in? Is this startup? Is this mature? Is this dying? Also then to determine, is the vision of the organization still pertinent today? In one case, the organization had already accomplished their vision. And sometimes we keep organizations or ministries going for the sake of keeping it going rather than towards the vision. If the vision has been accomplished, perhaps the season, as Ecclesiastes 3 would tell us, it's a season to end. So after that initial assessment, and that includes the leadership, the structure on it, but also then I try and pull in whichever leaders are still active in the organization and do our own SWOT analysis, determining what are the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats of the organization. We then go immediately to the vision of the organization, which is the why behind the organization, what the organization's all about. The mission, what the organization is doing to accomplish the vision, and then most critically is the values. What are the operating or cultural norms on how that organization will operate? And by going through that initial set coming in, you can typically find out which of the individuals are going to be staying with the organization, supporting it, raising it up to lead it through this transition, or which might need an exit plan to say, no, now's not the time for them to serve anymore and get fresh leadership on board with the organization.
It's an interesting process. Do you find that in Scripture, in the New Testament? Can you think of how that worked itself out?
I think the New Testament is filled with examples with how the church should be structured, but it doesn't give the detail of specific guidelines or rules. It gives us a framework for operating. And I would offer to you that in all examples in Scripture, in the New Testament particularly, there's a plurality of leadership involved in any organization, whether it be the church or outreaches. And what that does, that provides the framework for leaders to be successful, but it also keeps them true to the vision and mission that God has called them to do.
Okay, I want to press you on that a little bit. I would agree with you 100%. I'm a very strong plurality of leadership guy. But what do you mean by that? Paint the picture. When you say plurality of leaders, so does that mean there's not really a structure of one guy in charge or one gal in charge? How does that all work?
Again, if we want to go back to Scripture and see how the church operated to start with, it talked about the many gifts that God has given to the body, and every gift or every member of that body was dependent upon everybody else. Do you actually ever see in Scripture where there is one person that makes all the decisions and is in charge of any kind of outreach? You really don't see that very often. Rather than, you talk about God giving people gifts. You even put them in specific functions as prophets or apostles or evangelists or pastors or teachers, all working underneath the lordship of Jesus, but to accomplish the vision that He's called them to do.
There's a lot of truth to that, but it's very hard to make changes in organizations that have been doing it the same way for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. So, David, if you were to be brought in to do a seminar and let's just say, because most of my audience probably is nonprofit, church-oriented, to do a seminar on how to help leaders understand structure, give us 3 points that you would focus on to kind of leave us with today.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, the organization has to be anchored to the vision or the why we exist. Every person in that organization needs to know why we exist and what our end goal has to be in mind. Number 2, the structure has to move the organization forward to accomplish that vision and remove any barriers that might exist towards accomplishing that vision. For example, in the plurality of leadership, if we are driving towards a vision that's only based on one person's view, perhaps if that person fails, we're not going to be able to accomplish that vision. So hence, accountability, guidelines, rules of engagement for the leader of that organization in which they're going to operate. And then last, I would say, is establishing that the norms of operation. And that would include the cultural norms, the operating norms. What are the values of the organization? And are they clearly articulated, and can everybody buy into them on how we are going to be making decisions on moving forward to accomplish that vision that God has given to us?
So I understand you're going to write a book about this. I've been trying to get David to write a book on leaders and structure. I think it's, seriously, David, I really think it's a missing piece in most organizations today. They just don't value the structure. And yet the deacons in the book of Acts were really put in place to put structure to this young little church that was starting in Jerusalem, right?
Great example. You know, there was a couple different leadership forms that you see in the scripture. And again, they're not all detailed out. They're examples or a framework that we should be using in the church today. And they might serve as a good model for us in the nonprofit world as well. Accountabilities, clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and how we're going to operate together to accomplish the vision God's given to us.
So you have a lot of input at your job, in your corporate job, but what would be something of a resource that helped you the most kind of formulate your thinking on plurality of leaders and the assessment aspect and the whole structure thing? Is there something?
I think there's some great resources out there, and there's a lot dealing with what we call organizational design, or OD, that's out there for the marketplace that I think also the concepts work within a ministry or nonprofit organization. A couple resources I would mention, however, Patrick Lencioni has a podcast, weekly podcast, At the Table, it's called, which he talks about organizing in the marketplace in such a way to make this a high value for people and engaging workers in the workplace. And I think those principles go for both profit and nonprofit. The other resource I found quite useful is Henry Cloud has a book called Necessary Endings. And it's talking about when a leader is a hindrance to an organization and how we need to deal with that for the sake of the leader and for the organization. I think he just gives some great insight into that when we're assessing leaders for organizations as well.
David Diers, thank you so much for the insight and the conversation. We'll hope to have you back sometime soon, especially after you write that book.
Always my pleasure to be here, Larry.
Nothing is more important in life than knowing God. No amount of money, fame, or success can ever compete with knowing Him. Our values are not in a system, a set of rules, or in the latest motivational book. Our values are in a person named Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Karen from Las Vegas, and I listen to City Sites Podcast.
Well, my special thanks to David Diers for joining us today. I would love to circle around in a few months or so and bring David back and talk a little bit more about structure. Structure to me is probably the very core of what Scripture teaches. Everything from the Ten Commandments to the Sermon on the Mount to the epistles, all of the things that give us structure and how to live our lives and how to believe in God. And so structure is very, very important, and we need to find a way that in our local churches, in our ministries, to have the kind of structure that is actually positive in a sense of direction and purpose in how the structure is put together. So thanks again for joining us for the City Sites podcast. We'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you for joining us today. Every Friday, we bring you this podcast with interviews with people who are challenging the status quo of Christianity and challenging the cultural norms of our day. Please help us get the word out by sharing the link to this podcast with your online friends and family. Our website also contains other podcasters who are part of the City Sites network of communicators, all sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Our website is citysitesurbanmedia.com.